mass immigration that occurred after 1882 and lasted for 40 years roughly strained the resources of the Jewish community and of America. The enormity of the burden is almost impossible for us to understand. But think of it this way. What would happen if 10 times the size of our present community decided to arrive within a very short time and presented enormous needs? 10 times. The Jewish community went from about 250,000 people to around 4 million. And about 2.5 million of those were new immigrants. Add to that the fact that at this time, all charitable activity was private. All funds were raised through churches and synagogues. There was no government agency. There was no Medicare. There was no Medicaid. There was no Social Security. Nothing. Everything had to be done privately. So you can imagine, this is an absolutely astounding and huge burden on the Jewish community. Now, they decided they would meet this burden because even if they felt abused by the fact that all these people came at once and that they were so different that they changed the image of Jews in America, nonetheless they were Jews and they were brothers and sisters, and it was an obligation. It was a religious obligation to take care of them. But this meant that those in charge of the Jewish communities across this country had to adopt a new form of organization. They could not any longer do the kind of charitable work that was done by isolated congregations and small charitable groups like the Ladies' Welfare Fund or something like that. They had to do something more coordinated. Now, there had been attempts to coordinate before. In the aftermath of the Damascus Affair in 1840, they tried to write letters of support and talk to people in other communities, but it wasn't very effective. And then in 1850, the Swiss commercial treaty issue arose, and again they tried to coordinate between the communities, and again it wasn't very effective. It was only after the Mortara affair in the late 1850s that a new organization appeared called the Board of Delegates of American Israelites. And this was really the first time that Jewish communities were going to communicate, albeit not on a charitable issue. This was on a public relations and representing themselves in a political way. It didn't work terribly well, but it worked somewhat. And it morphed into the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in 1873. That was the organization of all Reform congregations in the country. But it was still not a charitable organization. It remained for about 20 years until the burden of these new immigrants got so severe that something had to be done. So what did they do? Well, they did exactly what they had done in years past. They borrowed a structure from the society around them. And that structure was the American Business Corporation. Now, what does a business corporation do? It does a few things. The first thing it does is it raises capital funds. It does that by selling stock, by getting loans, by selling bonds, a number of ways. And then it allocates these funds in ways that are centralized. There's a plan that is designed to use the money effectively to produce a product in the best and most efficient way. And then the corporation designs another substructure to sell that product. It may do that through other people. It may do that through their own agents. But the idea, of course, is that once you've produced the product efficiently, you've got to move it out to the customer and move it out efficiently at the least possible cost. So the idea of a corporation is to strive to use the resources in the most effective way possible. The biggest bang for the buck. And finally, a corporation accumulates profits, which it then distributes to the people or the organizations, such as banks, funds, that have helped it with loans and stock purchases and that kind of thing. Now, the Jewish community leaders of the 1890s modeled their new organization on the business corporation. It was called the Jewish Federation. And the first one appeared in Boston, Massachusetts in 1895. This model raised money. But it raised money in a new way. Instead of having a dozen or 15 or 20 or 30 small drives in the community, it had one centralized fundraising scheme. And all the money went into a central pot. In the same way that the corporation raised money through sale of stock, the Federation raised money by an appeal. And then there was a planning process. They asked themselves, what services are needed? For whom? Where should they be located? How should they be delivered? What's the best way to meet the need? What's the most effective and the most efficient way to deliver services to all of these people who so desperately need them? We can't have duplication because that's wasteful. So agencies that had done the same thing over and over were sometimes asked to abandon a certain project in favor of other things, and more often they were consolidated. And so you begin to get things like the Jewish Family Service or the Jewish Charitable Organization or something like that. Capital funds, that is, contributed funds, which is the capital of the Federation, were allocated through a centralized process, and they were used in a professional way. So we find the growth of a new profession, Jewish social workers, Jewish executives, similar to the staff of a corporation. And there's something else that happens. They're accountable. There's a board, which is like the board of a corporation, that says, we want to see how you're doing. We want to watch your performance. And if you don't do it in the very best way, we'll get somebody else. We'll fire you. It's accountable. What's the product they produced? They produced services. They produced services in the most efficient, useful way. And those services were then evaluated to be sure that they were being done properly, because there was no extra money to be spent on wasteful activities. Was there a profit? Not in the sense that there was a surplus of money that could be distributed back to the donors. It wasn't that kind of profit. The profit was a sense of accomplishment, a sense that we have done something important and we have kept faith with the values that have been transmitted to us ever since biblical times. We have been good stewards of our religion, our heritage, and we have been servants of our people, even when we were repelled slightly by their appearance and their mannerisms. Now, this was a top-down model. The people who ran the federations were wealthy people. Yes, they employed other folks, but most, if not all, of the decisions were made by the elite of the Jewish community. So it's from the top down. The federated model of systematic philanthropy, planning, delivery of services, evaluation of services, spread rapidly. And within 10 years, it was virtually universal in all Jewish communities of any size in the United States. It even had an impact on the non-Jewish community, because there's another model called the United Way. It used to be called the Community Chest. Same thing. A centralized agency to collect money and use it properly. So that was the top-down model. There was something else that was happening that came from the bottom up, and that was the labor union. The other structure that helped deal with the issues that Jewish people felt in those days. Now, there had been some experience in Eastern Europe, especially, with organization of workers. The Socialist Party and a group called the Bund, the group, had been very important in working with workers in Eastern Europe. And they had some success. Now, we've talked about the conditions of work in America, and let me just reiterate that they were awful. There was a large supply of desperate workers, people who needed jobs at any cost and were prepared to take whatever conditions and wages were offered because they could not say no. The competition for jobs was high, and the benefits were abysmally low. There were long hours, low pay, child labor, awful working conditions, especially in the clothing industry, unsanitary conditions, unregulated conditions, dangerous conditions. And there was abuse of workers, especially women workers. And what was the result? The result was often enough illness, such as tuberculosis, poverty, almost unavoidable, and occasional death. But these folks were so desperate, so lacking in hope, that they could not really challenge the system. Part of the system involved contract labor. Contract labor is where the work is decentralized. So often enough, somebody would bring pieces of clothing into an apartment or a tenement, and they would convert the living quarters into a mini factory. Piecework was the name of the game. You got paid for how many pieces of clothing you made. So if you got 10 cents a shirt, you were encouraged and motivated to make as many shirts as you possibly could, which meant working long hours, taking no breaks at all or very few, and going until it got so dark you couldn't see. This kind of exploitation was common in the early decades of the 20th century. In 1911, something happened to change that situation. There was a building called the Triangle Building. If you look at it from the outside, its shape is as a triangle. And there was a company in the Triangle Building on about the 10th floor called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. This was up in a high-rise, so to speak. There were no exits. After the workers got there in the morning, the doors were locked. They couldn't leave. They couldn't take breaks. They couldn't even go to the bathroom. A fire broke out. Nobody knows exactly how, but a fire broke out and killed 146 people. Some of them died of smoke, some of flame, and some by jumping out the windows because they thought that was the only way out. It made a private situation into a public cause. And there was a great deal of ferment in New York and elsewhere about working conditions. The situation was solved in large part by the workers themselves because they began to organize unions. Now, the United Hebrew Trades Union had begun as early as the 1880s. It had been a doctrinaire socialist organization led largely by Morris Hillquit and also by Daniel De Leon. In 1895, it was renamed the Socialist Trade and Labor Alliance. And the two leaders of this group rebelled against the conservatives who wanted to play the game, so to speak, according to all the rules set by the establishment. And they called strikes, especially a clothing makers' strike, and they started two Jewish unions, largely Jewish unions. One was called the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, and the other was called the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And that one still exists today. The results of unionization, they didn't come easily. They came with conflict, with arrests, with brutality by strikebreakers, by resistance from the owners and the people who let out the contracts for contract work. But slowly but surely, working conditions improved. Pay rose, benefits increased, collective bargaining became the norm. And the owners had to face the fact that the union was a force to be reckoned with, that they could stop production if you didn't take them seriously. Arbitration panels were created to resolve disputes before they got to the level of strikes. Now, the irony, in a sense, is that these workers and their unions, which were started under socialist auspices, actually stabilized the capitalist system of production by minimizing disruption, but they got something out of it too. And eventually there were two umbrella groups that were created, largely through Jewish activism. In 1886, A Jewish immigrant from England named Samuel Gompers created the American Federation of Labor. That was in Columbus, Ohio. And the AFL was based on a particular notion that each of the trades that worked in an industry had a right to its own organization. So if you were a carpenter, there was a carpenters group, then there was a masons group, then there was an electricians group or a gas fitters group. There were roofers and so on. In the clothing industry, there were hat makers and shirt makers and dress makers. There were cigar makers and there were nurses. And each profession or each trade had its own subgroup within the AFL. Gompers came from England in the 1870s. He was born in 1850. And he had a very simple and rather conservative notion. Keep it simple. Don't get involved in ideology. We're here to change the conditions of these workers. We're here to make their lives better. Now, there was another organization that came along about 50 years later called the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It was founded in Chicago in 1935. And it was founded for a very simple, different notion. It was founded that all the people who worked in a particular industry ought to have the same union. So John L. Lewis, for example, founded the United Mine Workers. Everybody who worked in any way for the mining industry could join that union. The United Steel Workers, anybody who worked in the steel industry, no matter what they did, was a member of that. The United Auto Workers, the most famous of its presidents was Walter Reuther. And all of these organizations, industrial organizations, across an entire organization, represented each of the groups, but together. And they had a lot of power because once they decided to go out on strike, they could paralyze an entire industry. Later, these two organizations, the AFL and the CIO, merged, and they became a major factor in American politics and economics. Now, what we have here are two different models of organization that grew up in response to a desperate need to help new immigrants cope with America and better their lives. The Federation and the collective power of the Union improved pay, hours, conditions, provided retirement benefits, provided clinics, provided housing. There are parts of the Lower East Side of New York where the unions actually built high-rise apartments for their workers. They provided political support. They supported their friends and tried to beat their enemies. All different kinds of things. What happened is that over the course of about a generation and a half, they managed to help American workers, and especially Jewish workers, rise out of the depths of poverty and enter at least the lower middle class, if not the middle class. And that is a remarkable success story by these people.